There is a moment your soulmate keeps remembering, but they never understood why it stayed so deeply connected to you. And recently, something someone said accidentally brought that moment back into their mind, and this time they saw it differently. Not from their perspective, but from yours. They suddenly began wondering what you were actually feeling when everything happened. At the time, they may have believed you were simply upset, becoming distant, or choosing not to communicate. They may have even convinced themselves that you would eventually forget about it. But what they didn't know was that something inside you changed during that moment. You may not have argued. You may not have demanded an explanation. You may not have shown them just how deeply their actions affected you. You simply became quieter. And sometimes, the quietest reaction carries the deepest wound. Imagine someone accidentally turning off a light in a room and walking away without realizing that the person inside was still trying to find their way through the darkness. That may be how your soulmate is beginning to understand what happened. Someone recently revealed a detail, mentioned something they witnessed, or simply described your reaction in a way your soulmate had never heard before. And suddenly the pieces started connecting. They are realizing that the moment they thought was temporary may have become a permanent turning point for you. The painful part is that they may now be asking themselves why you never told them the truth about how much it hurt. Why did you hide it? Why did you continue as though everything was fine? Why did you eventually pull away instead of explaining what was happening inside you? And the answer may be much deeper than they expected. Because sometimes you stop explaining your pain when you realize the person who caused it may never understand it. And your soulmate is only now beginning to understand that the silence they once misunderstood may have been the first sign that they were losing something they didn't yet realize they had. The thing they just discovered wasn't what you said, it was what you never said. Someone accidentally revealed a detail about that painful moment, and suddenly your soulmate was forced to look at the situation from an entirely different perspective. Until now, they may have believed they understood your reaction. They thought you were angry, distant, or simply unwilling to let the past go. But what they are beginning to realize is that they may have completely misunderstood what was happening inside you. The person who revealed this information may not have even realized how powerful their words would be. It could have been a casual comment, a passing conversation, or a detail they mentioned without thinking. But the moment your soulmate heard it, something inside them became still. They started remembering the exact circumstances surrounding that moment, and for the first time, they began asking themselves what you must have felt when it happened. Maybe they remember your face changing. Maybe they remember how quickly you became quiet afterward. Maybe they remember you saying that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. At the time, they may have accepted your words because believing you were okay was easier than questioning what was really happening. Now, however, they may be realizing that your silence wasn't proof that you weren't hurt. It may have been proof that you didn't believe explaining the pain would change anything. And that realization can hit much harder than an argument ever could. Imagine someone walking through a house after a storm and suddenly noticing damage they completely missed while the rain was falling. The walls are still standing, the rooms still look familiar, but now they can see the cracks that weren't visible before. Your soulmate may be looking at your past reactions in exactly that way. They are connecting things they once considered unrelated. The day you became quieter, the moment you stopped asking for reassurance, the way you began protecting your feelings, the distance that slowly appeared between you. They may now be realizing that these weren't random changes. Something happened, and that moment became the beginning of a shift they didn't understand at the time, and perhaps the hardest realization is that you may have given them an opportunity to understand without ever directly asking them to. Maybe your behavior changed subtly enough that they could have noticed if they had been paying closer attention. Maybe you stopped initiating certain conversations. Maybe you stopped sharing the things that once made you feel vulnerable. Maybe you became more careful with your words because you no longer wanted to give someone access to the parts of you they had already hurt. Your soulmate may now be replaying those changes and wondering why they didn't see them sooner. They might even be asking themselves whether you were waiting for them to notice. And the answer may be complicated. Perhaps a part of you did hope they would understand without being told. But another part of you may have already accepted that you couldn't keep explaining your heart to someone who wasn't listening carefully enough. This is where the accidental revelation becomes so important. It gave your soulmate information they never received directly from you, and because it came from someone else, they may finally be able to hear it without immediately becoming defensive. They aren't hearing you explain why you were hurt. They are hearing someone else describe what they saw, what happened, or what you went through. And suddenly, the truth feels impossible to dismiss. Now they may be asking themselves a question they never expected to ask. Did I really do that to them? Not because they suddenly discovered that the event happened, but because they are finally understanding its emotional impact. There is a huge difference between remembering what you did and understanding what it did to another person. They remembered the moment. Now they are remembering your reaction. They remembered the words. Now they are thinking about the silence that followed. They remembered the disagreement. Now they are wondering what happened inside you after the conversation ended. And that difference is where guilt begins. Because guilt often arrives when intention and impact finally collide. They may have never intended to hurt you as deeply as they did. They may have thought the situation would pass. They may have believed you were stronger than the pain you were hiding. But now they are starting to understand that being strong doesn't mean being unaffected. Your soulmate may also be realizing that you didn't become a different person overnight. You slowly became more guarded because something taught you that being completely open with them wasn't safe anymore. That doesn't mean you stopped loving them. It means trust and love stopped moving together the way they once did. You could still care about someone while becoming more careful around them. You could still miss someone while knowing you couldn't keep allowing the same wound to happen again. And that may be what your soulmate is finally beginning to see. The person they remember didn't simply disappear. That version of you learned something from what happened. And now, as they replay the moment with this new information, they may be realizing that the distance they once blamed on you may have started with a wound they helped create. They wanted to understand why you changed, and someone accidentally gave them the answer. But instead of giving them peace, that answer is forcing them to face something much more uncomfortable. They may finally understand the exact moment when they hurt the person they never wanted to lose. Now that your soulmate has finally heard what they never knew about that moment, something inside them is beginning to change because they can no longer look at the past through the same eyes. Before this revelation, they may have remembered the event as just another difficult chapter between you. They knew something happened, they knew you became different afterward, but they never fully connected those two things. They may have thought you simply needed space, that you were becoming emotionally distant for other reasons, or that you had made a personal decision to move on. But now they are beginning to see a very clear line between who you were before that moment and who you became afterward. And that realization can be incredibly uncomfortable, because when someone finally notices the difference, they naturally begin asking what caused it. They may be replaying your conversations, remembering your expressions, the things you stopped saying, and even the little changes in your behavior that they once ignored. It's almost as if they are going back through an old chapter of their life with a completely different understanding. Imagine looking at an old photograph and suddenly noticing something in the background that changes the meaning of the entire picture. The photograph hasn't changed. The people haven't changed. Only your understanding has changed. That is what may be happening inside your soulmate now. They're realizing that the signs were there, but they were looking at them through their own assumptions instead of trying to understand what you were actually experiencing. They may remember how open you once were with them, You may have shared your thoughts without hesitation, trusted their words, looked for their reassurance, or believed that if something went wrong, the two of you could simply talk about it and repair it. There was a natural openness in the connection. But after that painful moment, something became different. Maybe you didn't completely disappear. Maybe you still responded, still smiled, still acted normal, and still tried to keep the peace. But the emotional openness wasn't the same anymore. You stopped giving them access to certain parts of yourself. You stopped expecting them to understand without explanation. You may have continued caring while quietly lowering your expectations. And your soulmate may now be realizing that this was not you becoming cold. It was you becoming careful. There is a major difference between those two things. Coldness says, "I don't care anymore." Being careful says, "I care, but I don't want to be hurt like that again." And once they understand that difference, many of your past actions may suddenly make sense. The distance they once interpreted as rejection may have actually been self-protection. The silence they thought was stubbornness may have been disappointment. The emotional walls they blamed on your personality may have been built because something happened that made you afraid to remain completely vulnerable. This realization may also make them question their own memory of the relationship. They may be asking themselves whether there were other moments when you were hurting and they simply didn't notice. Was that really the only time? Were there signs they ignored? Were there conversations where you were quietly asking for understanding without saying the words directly? Did they mistake your patience for unlimited tolerance? These questions can become difficult because once someone discovers one hidden layer of the past, they start wondering how many other layers they missed. Your soulmate may now be looking at old conversations differently, remembering the moments when you suddenly became quiet or changed the subject. They may remember times when you said, "It's okay," even though something about your energy suggested it wasn't. At the time, they may have accepted the words because they didn't know what else to do. Now, they may be realizing that "it's okay" was not necessarily an invitation to forget what happened. It may have been your way of ending a conversation you no longer had the strength to continue, and this is where the guilt starts becoming more personal. Before, they could blame the situation. They could say there was bad timing, misunderstanding, emotional pressure, or circumstances beyond their control. But now, they are beginning to see their own role in what happened. They may be remembering the exact choice they made in that moment and wondering what would have happened if they had chosen differently. What if they had listened instead of defending themselves? What if they had stayed instead of walking away? What if they had asked what you were really feeling instead of assuming they already knew? What if they had understood that your silence wasn't permission to continue? These questions are painful because there is no way to travel backward and rewrite the moment. The past remains exactly where it happened. All they can do now is understand it differently. And sometimes that understanding arrives years after the opportunity to change the outcome has already passed. There may be one thought that keeps returning to them now. "I didn't know." They may genuinely feel that they didn't understand how deeply they affected you. But eventually, even that statement becomes complicated because not knowing doesn't completely remove responsibility. Sometimes the signs were there. Sometimes the other person simply wasn't paying attention because they believed the relationship would survive whatever happened. Your soulmate may now be realizing that they took your emotional presence for granted. They assumed there would always be another conversation, another opportunity, another chance to explain. They may have believed that even if things became difficult, you would eventually return to the same version of yourself. But people change when trust is wounded. They don't always announce the change. Sometimes they simply become quieter, more independent, and less willing to fight for something that keeps hurting them. That may be the part that hurts your soulmate the most now. They may realize that the person they miss isn't just the person you are today. They miss the version of you who trusted them without constantly questioning their intentions. They miss the version of you who gave freely, communicated openly, and believed that the two of you could overcome anything. They may finally understand that they didn't simply lose your presence. They lost access to a version of your heart that was available before the wound happened. Imagine holding a glass that has been repaired after breaking. It may still look beautiful. It may still hold water. But once you know it has been broken, you handle it differently. That is what trust can become. It doesn't necessarily disappear completely, but it becomes something that has to be handled with much greater care. And perhaps this is why their emotions are becoming so complicated. They may miss you, but they also feel guilty. They may want to know how you are, but they may fear what you would say if they approached you. They may want to apologize, but they may not know whether an apology can reach a wound that has already changed the person who carries it. They may wonder whether you would even believe them if they finally admitted that they understand. And that uncertainty can keep someone awake because they are no longer simply remembering what happened. They are imagining what could have happened if they had acted differently. They are confronting the version of the story that might have existed if they had protected the connection, instead of assuming it would protect itself. But there is something important you need to understand here. Your soulmate's realization does not mean you have to reopen the door immediately. Their guilt belongs to them. Their understanding belongs to them. You don't have to carry it for them. If they truly recognize what happened, then they must eventually learn how to sit with that truth without expecting you to make them feel better about it. Because real remorse isn't about saying, "I'm sorry you felt hurt." Real remorse begins when someone can finally say, "I understand what I did, I understand why it changed you, and I accept that I cannot erase the consequence." That is the level of understanding your soulmate may be approaching now. And once they reach that point, they may have to face the hardest question yet, not whether they hurt you, because they are beginning to understand that they did, but whether they are willing to take responsibility for the distance that came afterward. And now, the guilt begins to reach a completely different level, because your soulmate is no longer simply remembering what happened. They are beginning to understand their responsibility in what happened. Before this revelation, they could look back at that painful moment and tell themselves that it was complicated, that emotions were high, that neither of you understood each other, or that things simply unfolded the way they were meant to unfold. But now that someone has accidentally revealed what you were really feeling, those explanations don't feel as comfortable anymore. They may be sitting with a truth they cannot easily escape. They knew what they did, but they never understood what it cost you. And there is a difference between those two things. A person can remember an action without understanding its emotional consequences. They can remember the words they said without remembering the silence that followed. They can remember walking away without realizing that the other person spent much longer trying to recover from that moment. Your soulmate may now be experiencing that realization in a very personal way. They may be thinking about you differently, not as someone who simply became distant, but as someone who had a reason to become distant. And the more they understand that, the harder it becomes to place the blame anywhere else. They may be replaying the exact moment in their mind and asking themselves questions they never asked before. Why did I say that? Why didn't I listen? Why did I assume they would be okay? Why didn't I notice that their energy had changed? Why did I think they would always give me another chance? These questions can become incredibly heavy because there is no perfect answer waiting at the end of them. The moment already happened. The words were already spoken. The choice was already made. And perhaps your soulmate is finally understanding that sometimes the deepest consequences come from moments that seemed ordinary at the time. They may not have realized they were creating a memory you would carry for years. They may have thought the disagreement would disappear after a few days. They may have believed that eventually you would return to normal. But now they're beginning to understand that something inside you changed that day, and they were standing there when it happened. Imagine throwing a small stone into a completely still lake and walking away because the splash looks insignificant, never turning around to see how far the ripples continue moving. That is what regret can feel like. You don't regret only the stone. You regret not realizing how far the ripples would travel, and perhaps the most painful part for them is realizing that you didn't necessarily ask for anything impossible. Maybe you wanted honesty. Maybe you wanted reassurance. Maybe you simply wanted them to understand that your feelings mattered. Perhaps the moment that hurt you the most wasn't even about what they did, but about what their actions made you believe about your place in their life. You may have started wondering whether you were truly valued, whether your feelings were safe with them, or whether you had been giving more emotionally than they were willing to give back. Your soulmate may now be recognizing that the wound wasn't created by one sentence alone. It was created by what that sentence represented. It represented a disappointment. It represented a broken expectation. It represented the moment when something you believed about the connection suddenly became uncertain. And when they understand that, they may finally see why you didn't simply get over it. You weren't holding on to one argument. You were adjusting to a new reality. This is where their guilt may become difficult to hide from themselves. They may try to distract their mind, but the memory keeps returning. They may go through their day normally, yet something reminds them of you. A place, a song, a familiar phrase, a conversation that resembles something you once had. And suddenly they are back inside that moment, but now they are seeing it through the information they recently received. Before, they may have remembered your reaction and thought you were overreacting. Now they may wonder whether you were actually trying not to fall apart in front of them. Before, they may have thought your silence was stubbornness. Now they may understand it as disappointment. Before, they may have believed your distance was a choice you made against them. Now they may see that it was a choice you made to protect yourself. And that reversal can completely change how someone remembers a relationship. They may also be realizing that you gave them more chances than they deserved. Maybe you stayed when you could have walked away earlier. Maybe you tried to understand them even when you were hurting. Maybe you forgave things without receiving the apology you truly needed. Maybe you kept hoping that the person you loved would eventually recognize what your heart was trying to communicate. And when that didn't happen, you slowly stopped expecting it. Your soulmate may now be looking back and realizing that your patience was not proof that everything was fine. Your patience may have been proof of how much you cared. That is a difficult realization because it forces them to see that they may have mistaken your love for permission to keep making the same emotional mistakes. They may now understand that you weren't asking them to be perfect. You were asking them to care enough to notice, and this is where true guilt becomes different from simple regret. Regret says, I wish things had turned out differently. Guilt says, I understand that my choices contributed to why things turned out this way. Your soulmate may be moving from the first feeling into the second. They may no longer be able to say that the distance between you simply happened. They are beginning to see that there were moments when they could have acted differently. They could have listened. They could have been softer. They could have asked one more question. They could have stayed instead of leaving. They could have apologized before the silence became permanent. And now, knowing what they know about your pain, those possibilities may be replaying inside their mind like alternate versions of a life they can no longer access. But there is something even deeper happening. They may be realizing that the person they hurt is not exactly the person standing before them now. The experience changed you. It taught you to protect your heart differently. It taught you not to explain everything. It taught you that love without emotional safety can become exhausting. And they may be grieving that change because they know they cannot simply ask you to become the old version of yourself again. Imagine breaking something precious and then discovering that even after it is repaired, you cannot make it exactly the way it was before. The object still exists, the beauty may still be there, but the history is now part of it. Your soulmate may finally understand that your guardedness has a history, and they are part of that history. This realization may create a strong desire inside them to apologize, but even that can become complicated. They may wonder whether an apology would actually help you or simply make them feel better. They may fear that saying sorry now is too late. They may wonder whether you would believe them. They may wonder whether you even want to hear from them anymore. And those questions can keep them silent for a while longer. But silence doesn't mean the guilt isn't there. Sometimes guilt becomes quieter before it becomes actionable. A person has to sit with the discomfort long enough to understand that they cannot undo what happened. They can only decide what kind of person they will be after finally understanding it. So if your soulmate seems unusually reflective, distant, emotional, or conflicted right now, there may be more happening beneath the surface than you can see. They may be confronting the version of themselves that existed in that painful moment and realizing they don't like what they see. They may finally understand that they didn't just hurt your feelings. They affected your ability to trust them in the same way again. And perhaps that is the truth that weighs on them most heavily now. They thought you walked away because you stopped caring. But they are finally realizing that you walked away because caring had started to hurt too much. They cannot change that moment. They cannot erase the memory, but they can finally stop pretending it didn't matter. And once someone reaches that level of honesty with themselves, when final realization becomes impossible to avoid, they didn't simply lose the connection. They may have helped create the distance they now desperately wish they could cross. And now your soulmate is reaching the realization that may hurt more than the original moment itself. They are finally understanding what they lost when they hurt you. For so long, they may have focused on what happened between you, but now they are beginning to see what happened inside you afterward. They may realize that you didn't simply become distant one day. You slowly changed because something taught you that you could no longer love them in exactly the same way without protecting yourself. And this realization can be incredibly difficult to accept because they may finally understand that the version of you they miss most was the version they once had access to so naturally. The person who trusted them, opened up to them, believed their words, gave them chances, and continued hoping that things could become better may not exist in the same form anymore. You may still care. You may still remember. You may even still have feelings that you never completely erased. But something changed in the way you carry those feelings. And your soulmate may finally understand that this change had a beginning, and that beginning was connected to the moment they hurt you. Imagine someone holding a beautiful photograph of a person they love, only to realize that the photograph captures a version of that person who no longer exists. The face is the same, the memories are still real, but time and experience have changed what happens behind the eyes. That may be how your soulmate is beginning to see you now. They may be remembering how easily you once trusted them and wondering when that trust disappeared. They may remember how quickly you used to respond, how openly you communicated, how naturally you showed affection, and how willing you were to believe that problems could be repaired. Then they remember what happened, and suddenly the connection between those memories becomes painfully clear. They may be thinking that was when everything changed, not because the relationship ended immediately, but because something inside you stopped expecting the relationship to remain the same, and perhaps this is why their guilt feels different now. It's no longer only about wishing they had behaved differently during one moment. They are beginning to understand the long-term consequence of that moment. They may realize that they lost something much more valuable than a conversation or an opportunity. They lost emotional access. They lost the effortless trust that once existed between you. They lost the ability to assume that you would always be there no matter what happened. And when someone finally realizes that, they may start wondering whether the distance they now experience is actually the consequence of choices they once considered insignificant. They may have thought you were the one who changed everything by walking away, but now they are starting to understand that your walking away may have been the final result of many things that happened before it. This doesn't necessarily mean they are ready to return tomorrow. And it doesn't mean every feeling automatically leads to action. But something important has changed inside their understanding. They can no longer look at you and simply think they moved on. They may now be asking, what did I do that made them stop trusting me? And that question is much deeper. Because once someone starts asking what their actions did to another person's heart, they are no longer protecting themselves with the old story. They are taking responsibility. They are seeing the connection from your side instead of only remembering their own side of the story. And that may be the biggest emotional shift your soulmate has experienced in a long time. They may also be realizing that an apology cannot simply erase everything. They could say the perfect words and still not be able to return you to who you were before. They could explain their intentions, tell you they never meant to hurt you, and admit that they didn't understand the consequences. But even a sincere apology cannot change the fact that you experienced the moment and had to live with what followed. This is why your soulmate may be hesitant. They may know they owe you honesty, but they may also know that honesty comes with the risk of hearing something they don't want to hear. They may fear that you no longer need their explanation. They may fear that you have already healed without them. They may fear that the door they once assumed would always remain open has quietly closed, and there is something powerful about that realization. Because you are no longer waiting for them to understand your pain before allowing yourself to move forward. You may have already learned how to carry the memory without allowing it to control your life. You may have already accepted that some people understand your value only after they experience your absence. And if your soulmate is finally facing their guilt now, that realization belongs to them. You don't need to chase it. You don't need to remind them of what they did. You don't need to force an apology out of them. If they truly understand, they will eventually have to decide what responsibility looks like. Perhaps the most important thing they are finally learning is that you didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because continuing in the same way was hurting you. There is a difference between abandoning someone and protecting yourself from repeating the same emotional wound. They may now understand that your silence wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary. Your distance wasn't necessarily revenge. It was recovery. And your decision to stop explaining yourself wasn't because you had nothing to say. It may have been because you had already said enough and were tired of hoping someone would understand what they had repeatedly overlooked. So now your soulmate may be carrying two memories at the same time. They remember the person you were before they hurt you, and they see the person you became afterward. And somewhere between those two versions of you, they can finally see their own role. That realization can be painful, but it can also become the beginning of genuine growth. Because if they ever approach you again, they cannot simply ask for the old connection back. They would have to understand why it changed. They would have to show that they learned something. They would have to rebuild trust instead of assuming love will automatically restore it. And maybe that is the final truth hidden inside this entire revelation. They thought they lost you when you walked away. But now they're realizing that the loss began much earlier, at the exact moment they made you feel that your heart wasn't safe with them. Someone accidentally revealed the wound they never understood, and now your soulmate is finally seeing the consequence of their own actions. They cannot go back and change that moment. They cannot erase what you felt, but they can no longer pretend they don't know. And sometimes that is where real remorse begins. Not when someone misses you, not when they fear losing you, but when they finally understand exactly why you had to choose yourself.